Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. Portugal was the first country to build a global empire. Its ships reached Africa, Asia, and the Americas before almost anyone else, and for a brief moment, global trade flowed through Portuguese hands. And yet, Portugal did not lose its empire in a single war. There was no final battle, no decisive invasion, no moment when everything collapsed at once. Instead, the empire thinned, retreated, and quietly slipped out of relevance. What makes Portugal's story unusual is not how it fell, but how early the reasons for its fall were already present at its greatest moment of success. The same choices that allowed a small kingdom to reach the world also fixed the limits of what it could become. To understand how Portugal lost its empire, you have to begin not with ambition, but with desperation. Portugal did not set out to build an empire. It was trying to escape a trap. In the 15th century, Portugal was a narrow strip of land at Europe's edge, pressed against a stronger neighbor and facing an ocean it did not yet control. It had little fertile land, a small population, and no strategic depth. Unlike larger kingdoms, it could not afford prolonged stagnation. On land, Portugal was boxed in by Spain. Expansion eastward was politically and militarily unrealistic. To the west lay the Atlantic, vast, unpredictable, and poorly understood. For Portugal, geography was not an advantage, it was a constraint. The kingdom had no obvious direction left to grow. Economic pressure sharpened that constraint. European markets depended on Asian goods, and access to them was tightening. Prices rose, routes narrowed, and intermediaries controlled supply. For larger states, this was a problem. For Portugal, it was existential. Permanent disadvantage meant slow decline, not temporary hardship. Portugal's rulers were not chasing wealth for its own sake. They were trying to avoid being squeezed out of the system entirely. Without access to trade, Portugal risked becoming a minor coastal state, dependent on others for survival. The question was not how to dominate Europe, but how to remain relevant within it. The solution Portugal pursued was extreme because the situation demanded it. Instead of competing over land routes it could not control, Portugal turned to the sea. Sailing around Africa offered no guarantee of success, only the possibility of independence. The risks were enormous: unknown currents, long voyages, shipwrecks, disease, and total loss of investment. But failure carried a different kind of certainty, the certainty of decline. This was not a single bold leap, but a slow accumulation of risk. Portuguese expeditions advanced incrementally down the African coast, mapping winds, refining ship designs, and learning how to survive longer at sea. These voyages were not immediately profitable. Their value lay in knowledge, not treasure. Over time, that knowledge compounded. Portugal developed ships suited for long-distance travel and crews trained to operate far from home. By the time Portuguese sailors reached the Indian Ocean, they were not explorers stumbling into opportunity. They were specialists executing a survival strategy refined over decades. What Portugal sought was not territory, but leverage. It could not rule vast populations or occupy large interiors. Instead, it aimed to control movement, ports, straits, and sea lanes where trade could be intercepted. Naval artillery allowed a small state to exert pressure far beyond its size. Access mattered more than ownership. By choosing this path, Portugal solved its immediate problem. It found a way out of the corner it had been trapped in. But the solution carried consequences that were not yet visible. The empire that emerged was built for speed, precision, and central control, qualities that worked brilliantly at first and imposed limits that would later prove impossible to escape. Portugal's solution worked, almost too well. Once its fleets entered the Indian Ocean, results came quickly and decisively. Portuguese ships intercepted spice traffic at sea, forcing merchants to reroute through ports under Portuguese control. Fortified positions at places like Goa, Malacca, and Hormuz allowed a small European kingdom to insert itself into the heart of global commerce without conquering the lands behind it. This success reshaped Portugal's position in the world in a single generation. Revenue flowed back to Lisbon through customs duties and monopolies, funding larger fleets and heavier armaments. Ships grew bigger, cannons more numerous, and voyages more frequent. Distance, once a barrier, became a weapon. Portugal could strike, withdraw, and reposition faster than any rival accustomed to land-based warfare. But the empire that emerged was deliberately thin. Portugal did not have the population to settle Asia or the resources to occupy vast territories. Control was concentrated at the coastline, ports, anchorages, and choke points where trade could be pressured or diverted. Inland societies remained largely independent, their cooperation secured through intimidation or negotiation rather than rule. This design favored speed over depth. A handful of well-armed ships could dominate regional trade without the slow work of administration or integration. As long as Portugal controlled access, it did not need to govern people. The system was efficient, aggressive, and highly profitable under the right conditions. Governance reflected that narrow focus. Authority remained centralized in Lisbon, where the crown appointed governors and captains to enforce monopolies and collect revenue. The empire's legitimacy flowed downward from the king, and success was measured in throughput rather than stability. What mattered was keeping trade moving and competitors out, yet this structure assumed that conditions would remain favorable. It depended on naval superiority, limited competition, and the absence of rivals capable of sustained pressure. It left little room for redundancy. If a port fell or a route shifted, the system did not absorb the shock. It rerouted around it, hoping losses would remain manageable. At its height, Portugal's empire appeared formidable. It moved faster than any rival and reached farther than any predecessor. But it was built to exploit an opening, not to endure a changing world. Beneath the speed and firepower lay a fragile assumption that no one else would learn how the system worked. They did. And when they did, the weaknesses of an empire built for velocity rather than resilience would become impossible to hide. From Lisbon, Portugal's empire appeared tightly controlled. Orders flowed outward from the crown, monopolies were declared in law, and governors were appointed to enforce royal authority across oceans. On paper, the system was centralized, disciplined, and absolute. In reality, distance transformed control into something far more fragile. Communication moved at the speed of sailing ships. Instructions could take months to arrive, and by then circumstances had often changed. Officials on the ground were forced to decide first and explain later. Over time, discretion became necessity. Authority existed, but it was delayed, conditional, and unevenly applied. The men who operated this system were not bureaucrats shaped by routine. Overseas service attracted adventurers, individuals willing to risk disease, violence, and isolation in exchange for opportunity. Many viewed imperial appointments as temporary chances to enrich themselves before returning home. Royal discipline weakened the farther it traveled. This produced an empire that functioned through compromise rather than command. Smuggling became routine. Private trade flourished alongside official monopolies. Captains bent rules to maintain local alliances, and governors overlooked violations in exchange for stability. What mattered was keeping ports open and profits flowing, not enforcing purity of policy. The consequences were visible in East Asia. Portuguese traders pushed into Chinese waters without formal permission, sometimes seizing islands, building unauthorized forts, and engaging in kidnapping and piracy. These actions were not centrally planned, but they defined how Portugal was perceived. Local authorities judged the empire by the behavior of its agents, not by its decrees. When Chinese officials resisted, Portugal discovered the limits of naval intimidation. Sustained enforcement was impossible without local cooperation. The Portuguese presence survived only through accommodation, culminating in Macau, a settlement tolerated under strict conditions. It was not a conquest, but an admission of constraint. By the end of the 16th century, Portugal's empire still existed, but its control was largely performative. It relied on familiarity, inertia, and the absence of better alternatives. The crown projected authority, but actual power depended on acceptance by others. This illusion held only as long as Portugal remained the most convenient option available. The moment a rival could offer access with greater reliability and fewer risks, the foundations of this informal system would begin to give way. Portugal's methods were never secret. Other European powers watched closely as Portuguese ships enforced monopolies, leveraged ports, and extracted profit with limited manpower. What they learned was not just how to build a global presence, but where that presence was vulnerable. Portugal had shown what was possible. It had also revealed what could be improved. In Northern Europe, merchants and rulers drew a different conclusion from the same evidence. The problem with Portugal's system was not its reach, but its rigidity. Power was tied to a crown, risk was concentrated, and recovery depended on royal approval. For competitors, the lesson was clear. If trade could be organized without resting on a single ruler, it could move faster and endure losses more easily. This shift mattered because Portugal's empire depended on being indispensable. Its informal arrangements worked only when alternatives were scarce. Once rivals appeared who could offer comparable access with greater predictability, the balance began to shift. Merchants did not need to overthrow Portuguese forts. They could simply choose other partners. The change was gradual but decisive. Portuguese ports that had once been unavoidable became optional. Routes that had been controlled by intimidation were bypassed by scale. Where Portugal relied on case-by-case negotiation and personal authority, its rivals arrived with standardized practices and steady supply. Portugal could see this happening, but its institutions were poorly suited to respond. Reform would have required loosening royal monopolies and sharing authority over trade, steps that threatened the legitimacy of the system itself. The Crown chose preservation over adaptation, even as preservation became increasingly costly. By the early 17th century, the world Portugal had helped create was no longer waiting for Portugal to lead it. Global trade was expanding beyond the structures that had first organized it. The empire still stood, but the ground beneath it was shifting. What Portugal faced next was not invasion, but competition organized on entirely different terms. The alternative that emerged did not challenge Portugal with armies first, it challenged it with organization. In the Netherlands, overseas trade was reorganized around a simple idea. Risk did not need to be carried by a single crown. By pooling capital from many investors, merchants could fund permanent fleets, absorb losses, and expand operations without waiting on royal approval. This change altered the tempo of competition. Dutch ships sailed more frequently and replaced losses more easily. A failed voyage did not cripple the system. It informed the next one. Decisions were made by directors accountable to investors, not by officials navigating court politics. Information moved quickly because it had economic value, not because it served state prestige. England followed a similar path. Its merchants adopted joint stock organization to bypass the limits of royal monopoly, not to abolish the state. Like the Dutch, they did not need to defeat Portugal everywhere. They only needed to be better in enough places to redirect trade. Reliability and scale did the work that cannons once had. Portugal had no comparable mechanism. Its empire was financed through royal revenue and governed by appointment. When a ship was lost or a port contested, the cost fell directly on the crown. Recovery required new authorization, new funds, and new personnel. Each setback reduced future capacity, tightening a spiral the system could not escape. The difference became visible across Asia. Where Portuguese officials negotiated case by case, their rivals arrived with standardized contracts and steady supply. Where Portugal defended monopolies through force, its competitors competed on price and volume. Merchants adjusted quickly. Trade followed predictability. This was not a sudden collapse. Portuguese flags still flew over forts, and Portuguese ships still sailed. But the center of gravity had shifted. The empire that once set the rules now reacted to them. Portugal had pioneered global maritime power, but the system it created had evolved beyond the institutions that built it. By the time this reality was clear, the empire's resilience depended on something far more fragile than organization or reform. It depended on the stability of a single royal line, an assumption that would soon be tested. Portugal's imperial system was never designed to survive uncertainty at the center. Authority flowed from the crown, and continuity depended on the stability of the royal line. As long as the monarch remained competent and succession was secure, the system functioned. When that assumption failed, there was no backup. King Sebastian came to the throne young and deeply shaped by religious conviction. He inherited an empire already under strain, facing competitors who were faster, richer, and better organized. But Sebastian did not see adaptation as the solution. He saw renewal through faith and conquest. In 1578, he committed Portugal to a crusading campaign in North Africa, seeking glory against Muslim forces rather than consolidation at home. The decision was personal and catastrophic. Sebastian led the expedition himself, bringing with him much of Portugal's nobility and military leadership. The campaign ended in disaster. The king was killed, the army destroyed, and a generation of experienced elites wiped out in a single afternoon. Portugal lost far more than a battle. It lost the people who held its political system together. Worse still, Sebastian left no heir. The absolute monarchy that demanded centralized authority now faced a succession crisis with no institutional mechanism to resolve it. Trade continued, revenues flowed, but governance stalled. The empire, already fragile, drifted without direction at the moment it needed clarity most. Into this vacuum stepped Spain. King Philip II asserted his claim to the Portuguese throne and was accepted as king, forming the Iberian Union. Portugal retained its laws and identity in name, but strategic autonomy vanished. Decisions about war, diplomacy, and empire were now subordinated to Spanish priorities. What made this moment decisive was not defeat, but exposure. Portugal's empire had survived competition, corruption, and decline. It could not survive the collapse of its center. The system that had concentrated authority to move quickly now concentrated vulnerability. When the king fell, the structure fell with him. The Iberian Union preserved the appearance of continuity, but it changed the logic of Portugal's empire completely. Portugal still possessed overseas territories, but it no longer controlled the decisions that determined their fate. Strategic priorities were now set in Madrid, not Lisbon, and Portugal's empire was folded into conflicts it had not chosen. Spain was already engaged in wars across Europe against Protestant powers. By becoming part of the Spanish monarchy, Portugal inherited these enemies overnight. To the Dutch and the English, Portuguese ports and ships were no longer neutral trading hubs. They were legitimate targets in a wider struggle against Spain. This shift was devastating because Portugal's empire had never been designed for sustained, multi-front warfare. Its forts intimidated merchants and local rulers, but they were not built to withstand coordinated assaults by industrializing maritime states. Once Portugal was absorbed into Spain's wars, its vulnerabilities were exposed simultaneously across Asia, Africa, and the Atlantic. The Dutch moved first and most effectively. With experience in Asian trade and joint stock backing, they attacked Portuguese positions systematically. Each captured port weakened the remaining network, making the next loss easier. Portugal lacked the reserves to recover. Ships could not be replaced quickly enough, and lost routes were not easily reclaimed. Portugal's ability to respond was constrained at every level. Its fleets were absorbed into Spanish strategy, its revenues diverted to European wars, and its colonial priorities subordinated to conflicts far removed from trade. Portuguese ships sailed as part of Spanish armadas, and when those fleets failed, Portugal absorbed losses it could not afford. The Iberian Union lasted 6 decades, long enough for rivals to entrench themselves, and for Portugal's early advantages to disappear entirely. When Portugal finally regained independence in 1640, much of its Asian empire was already gone. Sovereignty returned, but capacity did not. By the mid-17th century, Portugal's empire had been reduced to a defensive posture. It still possessed overseas territories, but it no longer dictated terms. The empire survived, but its center of gravity shifted toward a single possession that could still sustain it. That possession was Brazil. Brazil did not reverse Portugal's decline, but it slowed it enough to change how the end would look. Unlike the trading posts of Asia, Brazil was a territorial possession with land, labor, and the potential for internal wealth. When gold was discovered there in the late 17th century, it arrived just as Portugal's imperial system was losing ground elsewhere. The influx of gold stabilized the crown and masked structural weakness. Revenue flowed steadily into Lisbon, funding the court, servicing debts, and sustaining the state without requiring reform. Immediate pressure eased, and with it the urgency to adapt. Portugal survived not because it became stronger, but because it could postpone reckoning. This dependence reshaped the empire's priorities. Instead of rebuilding maritime capacity or modernizing administration, Portugal reorganized itself around extraction. Brazilian wealth replaced lost Asian revenue, but it did not rebuild the system that had produced it. Survival became the goal, not recovery. The consequences unfolded gradually. Easy revenue reduced incentives to diversify the economy or invest in institutional reform. Where other European powers reinvested profits into industry, fleets, and infrastructure, Portugal consumed its windfall. The empire endured, but its capacity to compete did not grow. This imbalance became clear during the Napoleonic Wars. When France invaded the Iberian Peninsula, the Portuguese royal family fled to Brazil, transferring the seat of empire across the Atlantic. The move preserved the monarchy, but it altered Brazil's political status. For the first time, the colony functioned as the center of power. Living as the seat of government changed expectations. Brazil gained administrative experience, political confidence, and a sense of autonomy that could not be undone. When the royal court eventually returned to Lisbon, the old colonial hierarchy no longer reflected reality. Independence followed not through conquest, but through recognition of a shift already complete. With Brazil gone, Portugal's empire contracted sharply. What remained were scattered African territories and symbolic holdings. The wealth that had delayed decline had also ensured that no recovery followed. Portugal endured, but only in diminished form, moving toward the final phase of its imperial story. After Brazil, what remained of Portugal's empire was no longer a system. It was a remainder. Its African territories were vast on maps, but thin in control, sustained more by historical claims than by real administrative reach. Portugal still spoke the language of empire, but the world had moved into an age defined by industrial capacity, population scale, and capital depth, none of which Portugal possessed in sufficient measure. This gap became undeniable during the late 19th century. Portugal proposed an ambitious plan to link its colonies in Angola and Mozambique across the African continent, asserting a continuous corridor based on centuries of presence. On paper, the plan preserved imperial continuity. In reality, it collided with British ambitions backed by naval power, capital, and diplomatic leverage. When Britain issued an ultimatum, Portugal had no meaningful way to resist. The humiliation exposed a deeper exhaustion. The empire no longer justified the sacrifices required to maintain it, yet it continued to shape political decisions at home. Reform stalled, monarchs hesitated, and public frustration grew. Imperial identity outlived imperial capacity, trapping Portugal between memory and reality. Internal instability followed. In the early 20th century, the monarchy collapsed after the assassination of the king, and a republic was proclaimed. The change altered Portugal's political form, but not its position in the world. The state still lacked the resources and institutions needed to sustain global influence. The empire endured more as inheritance than as strategy. Decolonization unfolded slowly and unevenly. Portugal held on to territories long after their strategic value had diminished, often at great cost. Withdrawal came not through decisive defeat, but through exhaustion. Each retreat reduced Portugal's global footprint, but none resolved the limits that had shaped its decline from the beginning. The final chapter arrived quietly. When Portugal transferred Macau to China in 1999, it marked the end of an empire that had begun more than 5 centuries earlier. There were no battles and no declarations of loss. The handover was orderly, almost administrative. By that point, the empire existed more as history than as power. Portugal did not lose its empire because it failed to act. It lost it because the system it built could not evolve beyond the conditions that first made it successful. The choices that allowed a small kingdom to reach the world also fixed the boundaries of what it could become. As the world changed, Portugal endured, but it could not keep up.